Great. Good morning, everyone. This is Bonnie Holman with SES Global Services. I want to welcome everybody to today's webinar. Before we get started, I'm going to go over a few housekeeping items. Everybody in the webinar is in listen-only mode. During the webinar, you're able to type any questions that you have into the question box, and we'll have time at the end of the presentation to answer those questions. This presentation is being recorded, so those of you that have registered for the webinar will receive a link to it tomorrow. And yeah, we'll go ahead and get started. And next slide. Great, so the webinar today is covering corporate ESG in the food and agriculture sector. And I am very pleased to be joined by my colleague Brittany. The webinar is structured as a dialogue, so we're going to be pulling together viewpoints from SES Global Services and also a new part of SES, which is SES Consulting, which you'll hear a little bit more about. The webinar will be kind of a dialogue between Brittany and myself, kind of covering different parts of the supply chain and focusing on ESG. So a little bit about Brittany and myself. My name is Bonnie Holman. I'm the Technical Director and Senior Consultant in Sustainable Agriculture for SES. I've been with the company for over 8 years, working largely in the sustainability, voluntary standards part of our business. I've been working in food and agriculture for over 10 years. Working in Latin America with growers prior to joining SES. My background is in environmental policy and resource management, and I'm very happy to be here today. Brittany, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Bonnie, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm very excited about this dialogue and this conversation. So I'm Brittany Stepanek. I'm an Associate Director here at SES Consulting Services, and like Bonnie mentioned, I'm part of SES Consulting Services, which is a new entity underneath the SES Global Services umbrella. We are a separate legal entity, and we focus just on consulting services, and it enables us to help our clients in a way to get ready for whatever they need to, and I'll discuss a little bit more about that a little bit later. I'm an energy systems engineer by training. I help clients with my team all over the world to set, meet, and surpass their sustainability goals. So we'll dive into what we're seeing a little bit more in the industry in the next 45 minutes.
Great. Next slide. Great, so this is actually the fifth webinar in a 5-part series. In this webinar, we're focusing really on corporate ESG and how it's influencing food and agriculture companies within the sector. And really going to be looking at, some ways that supply chain actors can respond to some ESG trends in order to kind of take more ownership over their own operations within the ESG kind of ecosystem. Next slide. So before we get started on the topic, a little bit about SES. So SES Global Services is a certification body located in California's Bay Area. We have satellite offices around the world. On the map, the dark blue countries are where satellite offices are located. We also have a number of affiliate organizations that work with us. Those are kind of the medium blue colors on the map. And really, SES has been a leader in really setting the bar for sustainability across all major markets. We have nearly 40 years of experience, over 200 sustainability staff, and we provide services to over 24,000 clients across the globe. And that's all occurring in a range of sectors, from forestry to energy, green building, consumer products, and of course, food and agriculture, which we're going to focus on today. Next slide. So this is just a menu of some of our core certification and standards that we operate within the food and agriculture sector. It's not all inclusive, but just highlights some of the main programs that we offer.
Okay, great. And I know since SES Consulting Services is a new entity, we wanted to just take a minute to describe what we do and why we were invited to this webinar by SES Global Services. So we're really happy to do that. Ultimately, our sustainability team, what we do is we serve as a strategic partner for our clients wherever they are in their sustainability journey. Our focus is always to develop solutions that are right-sized for your company, but always founded in science, just like our parent company, SES Global, which they've been have an amazing track record of the last 40 years in this space, and we're happy to continue that and expand it through our consulting services. But I won't go into these, but just to give you a sense, ultimately the consulting team, what we do is we focus a lot on strategy, a lot of materiality assessments right now. We work with companies on their greenhouse gas endeavors, whatever that may look like. A key thing right now is science-based targets, which we'll touch on a little bit later. We help clients develop programs and also to report to various different ESG frameworks and rating systems. And ultimately, what our goal is just to serve as a strategic partner. So we're there with you throughout your entire journey. It may be a phone a friend type of system where we're there to help you figure out where to start and where to go, or it could be helping to develop some of your systems in collaboration with you. So really, wherever you are, we're really there to help you establish a starting point, develop solutions, and a key part of what we like to do is train you and make sure you're able to implement these systems more independently in the future and set you up for success in whatever your ESG goals are. So with that, I'll pass it back to Bonnie to talk about our agenda.
Great. Thank you. That was a wonderful summary of SES Consulting. So what we're going to cover today, introductions, we've covered that. We're going to start off talking about emerging ESG trends, their relevancy to the food and agriculture sector, how to get started on where you're at and where you need to go, looking at sustainability convergence in supply chains, and we'll wrap up with going over 5 best practices and tools to use within supply chains. We're really hoping that we can help kind of engender some learning today and meet the objectives that you see here on the slide. Great, so let's start off with the first question for Brittany. So Brittany, what trends have you been seeing right now in the food and agriculture industries?
Yeah, definitely. There have been a lot of trends, which I'm sure a lot of people on this call are sensing. When I was thinking through this slide, I was going to focus on food and agriculture trends, but I think it's worth noting some industry agnostic trends first, which very much are relevant to the food and ag sector. So the first one to highlight is science-based targets. Man, this program is exploding, as many of you may be on the phone realizing or hearing about very frequently. Just to give you some context, 11% of the science-based targets that are currently in commitment or target phase are actually associated with the food and agriculture sector, which is pretty incredible. The food and beverage processing sector is actually the second most prevalent in terms of overall science-based targets set. So many of you on this call already have science-based targets. I know many of you are thinking about it, but that's definitely one trend we're seeing. Another trend is that CDP reporting has increased significantly in this last year, and we expect that to continue. If you're not familiar, CDP was formerly the Carbon Disclosure Project, but really it's a tool for, on an annual basis, disclosing your climate, water, and/or forest impacts. And we anticipate that a lot more people will be requested to report to CDP, and we'll have to do that on an annual basis and get ready for that. Another trend that we're seeing, which frankly I think is a really great one, is that largely due to this pandemic that we're all navigating, it seems like social issues are coming to the forefront a lot more than they had been previously. So especially, we're noticing the pandemic is driving inequalities, and companies are starting to respond, but also report on what they are doing to combat and curb those issues. So that's a really great trend we're seeing. And then the last one I think is still emerging a little bit, but ultimately there's a lot of focus on biodiversity, especially in this sector. I know many of you have biodiversity goals already. I think just an example of how this is going to continue to trend, there is going to be soon, in 2023, a task force on nature-related financial disclosures. And so this is really about acknowledging that our nature-based, our nature and ecosystems have a financial value. And I think we're going to start to see a lot more reporting around that, and we're starting to hear that already from the industry. Many of you are familiar with TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and so this is a similar concept to that. I, of course, could have put a million other things on this slide, but these are some key ones that we're seeing and that are industry agnostic, but still, in our opinion, affecting this industry pretty heavily. In terms of industry specific trends, there are so many. It was hard to narrow it down, but I think some of the key ones really are here. Scope 3 emissions is incredibly prevalent, and a lot of you on this call are trying to tackle and understand what your Scope 3 impacts are. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Scope 3 emissions are all of your emissions associated with your value chain, so upstream and downstream. And so basically all the way through raw material extraction, through things like waste operating generations, employee commuting, investments. It's a very tough and challenging and complex topic. And so we're seeing companies really starting to dive in a lot more on what that looks like. Regenerative agriculture continues to emerge as a trend, especially knowing the carbon sequestration potential and the many other environmental and economic and ecosystem benefits associated with that, especially in terms of soil health. Biodiversity, I mentioned already. Human rights and labor, I think, is both internationally and domestically, is increasingly becoming to the forefront and being an expectation to report on all the way back to your value chain. Water is also emerging, so in much bigger way, I think in a much more scientific way. So there's a lot of discussions around science-based targets for water, and I think that will continue to expand and develop as we learn more about how best to do that and share that resource across all of our different businesses. Traceability and transparency, of course, this is not necessarily new information, but particularly for high commodity resources like cocoa and coffee and palm oil, it's certainly becoming an expectation to have transparency down into your supply chain. Packaging in this sector, of course, has always been a priority and continues to do that. A lot of emphasis now on transitioning from plastics and to incorporating more recycled content. And lastly, alternative proteins. We're hearing a lot about that, especially as you think about the greenhouse gas emissions associated with meat production. Transitioning to more plant-based items, for example, is a trend a lot of companies are really focusing on and thinking through in their R&D departments, knowing that their consumers are interested in a more environmentally friendly option. So there's a lot of trends on this slide. There are a lot of trends in this industry, but those are kind of the top ones that we're seeing so far. So Bonnie, let me pass it back to you. Why do you think that this sector in particular is focusing a lot on sustainability and ESG initiatives?
Great. Well, you mentioned a lot, you know, in the last slide, Brittany. One of the things that I think is so interesting about the food and agriculture sector is really kind of where it sits when we're looking at sustainability from a global perspective. So I want to just back it up to just a higher level briefly. You know, agriculture is seen as in one way, you know, being a part of the problem in terms of global greenhouse gas emissions, in terms of our impact on the planet. It's also more and more being positioned as part of the solution. We also know that it faces a number of challenges. So, you know, just some numbers for the audience, you might know this, but just to kind of give a perspective of, you know, why sustainability in the food and agriculture sector is so necessary and needed. First of all, global agriculture represents 70% of global water withdrawals, the largest sector of global water withdrawals. It's over 1/3 or about 1/3 of total global greenhouse gas emissions. And then within that 1/3, 80% of that is coming from the supply chains within the food and agriculture system. So that's all Scope 3. That's all where we're focusing on with science-based targets, moving away from Scope 1, Scope 2, and including, I should say, Scope 3. It's also one of the main industries where modern slavery is found. So your issues like forced labor, child labor, and this is an issue that you highlighted that's getting more attention during the pandemic. We've seen this topic gaining ground in the last 5 to 7 years or so, because the percentage of modern slavery is actually increasing in the sector, not going down. It's also one of the main drivers to deforestation and biodiversity loss, so your land use change issues. So, you know, it's really representing a lot of impacts on some of the priority topics that you already mentioned. And yet, we are all human. We all need to eat. Food systems are integral to our existence. So we're also challenged in the next 30 years to grow significantly more food to meet global population growth projections. So increasing some sort of sustainable yield on the land that we already have, and doing so because we have to essentially stop deforestation, stop biodiversity loss associated with agriculture, stop land use change, and do a better job of growing more food on the acreage that we already have allocated for agriculture. We have to do this while building resiliency to withstand the climate impacts that are going to happen across our globe. There may be drought in one region and increased rainfall in another. There may be intense climate impacted weather events that cause significant crop damage. So we need to build resiliency into our system to account for that. And we have to address all of these environmental impacts while also looking at creating a more socially equitable food system where we're able to eradicate modern slavery, get those numbers down, meet sustainable development goals, and essentially lift farmers and farm workers out of poverty. So there's some significant challenges that are facing us, and so I view the food and agriculture sector as, you know, being a very, very interesting place to work as we're talking about, you know, larger corporate ESG and how it's applied within supply chains. So with that, you know, Brittany, for companies that are just kind of starting out on their journey, where do you recommend they begin?
Yeah, great question. And I think this is a particularly good one for likely many of you on this call. Building off what Bonnie said, there's a lot of challenges in this sector. And so I just want to point out that one of the challenges is to really figure out where to begin. And I love this slide because it really, in my mind, hopefully it does in yours, captures like the chaos of all the different things that we need to understand and navigate and are being asked about. And really understanding the space can be incredibly daunting. And so I just want to you know, maybe validate some of your stresses if you are having any, and to acknowledge that all of these things are interconnected. They can't be really considered in silos. And I think part of the challenge is, again, like figuring out where to start. And I wish there was like a you know, silver bullet for each one of us, right? But ultimately it's a conversation and everyone's path is different. You know, typically when we help companies establish priorities, it usually falls in like 4 different pathways, and really a combination of those pathways. And so hopefully some of these will resonate with you and maybe could be a great starting point to think through. Or if you've already started your journey, you know, maybe you'll be able to reassess based on some of these topics. But one of the first things is really doing a gap analysis. So you may have an ESG standard or a framework or a customer request or some other requirement that you have to do. And so the first thing to figure out priorities is assess what your gaps are. So this could be a really great way to just, you know, in an instant or pretty quickly be able to understand like what to prioritize in a given moment, in a given year, and start to allocate your resources, budget, priorities towards that. This is very focused, of course, on your operations and on any standard or framework that you choose. You can do this with multiple standards and frameworks. You don't need to limit it. But one thing that we often do in combination with this, and I'd recommend, is benchmarking. And so really understanding where the broader industry is, and especially your specific peer set. So how do you compare in terms of your peers? And it's not really just about a competitive thing. It's really just like, what are people doing and how could I learn from you? How can I learn to advance my own journey? Because you're not the only ones who are trying to figure this out, right? The whole industry is trying to figure this out. And so how can you learn from each other and maybe even collaborate to figure out what to focus on? And I like this option a lot because it kind of gives you a sense of where you stand and can help prioritize based on the gaps that you're seeing in terms of what your competitors or peers are doing. Another key one, I think, especially in this sector, is really assessing your risks throughout your value chain. Wherever you are in your value chain, you'll need to understand where your risks are coming from, because at the end of the day, you have to deliver a certain commodity or product and put something on the shelf or send something on a truck. And so if there's anything like business risk wise that could affect your ability to do that, it's likely there might also be an ESG topic associated with that. Maybe it's water scarcity, maybe it's a logistics issue. And so there are a lot of risks that I think businesses are facing, and that can help you kind of prioritize and also bring that into your sustainability journey. It doesn't have to be existing in a silo. In fact, it shouldn't. Sustainability is so broad, and it should be focused on in every single job function in your organization. And so thinking through that across your business units or your value chain is really helpful. One of the last, more common for maybe the medium and larger size companies that we help establish priorities with is just establishing a materiality assessment. Many of you may have heard that term before. Some of you might be hearing it for the first time. We're not going to go into what that is today necessarily, but at a high level, it's engaging all of your stakeholders to understand what they are prioritizing. And those stakeholders aren't just internal. There are internal stakeholders, of course, like employees, but also talking to investors, customers, in some cases, competitors, industry groups, industry associations, all types of different stakeholders who have some sort of influence or desire to prove something from you, and identify what those priorities are, and then quantify what the impacts are. So if it's a high priority for stakeholders and you have a high potential to impact that priority, that's something that you should be focusing on. And so a lot of folks will do this in preparation for reporting. So Global Reporting Initiative, GRI reporting, for example, or SASB reporting. So these are 4 common pathways. Again, there's no right answer for everybody, and a lot of it is a combination of this. But these are a great way to start. It's also really helpful to understand where your requests are coming from. So I know a lot of our clients right now, and I'm sure a lot of you on this call are kind of stressed out about all these requests you've been getting. And I think the key to understand too is that, brands are really under a lot of pressure. Again, I could put a million things on this slide, but I'll just point out a few. They're getting pressure from investors. And so just an example, FAIR, it just started 5 years ago and is already growing exponentially. And this is a group of investors focused on ESG just in the food sector. There's also, as we mentioned before, a lot of investors focused on CDP reporting. They're requiring reporting from a lot of different organizations across the world. Consumers are also providing pressure and changing their brand expectations. And so people are actually expecting now that recycled and sustainable materials are going to be part of their everyday shopping experience. They're also considering sustainability concerns in their eating habits. This isn't necessarily new. This has been a growing trend over the last few years, but I think what we're seeing is that's not going to stop. It's continuing, and I think companies are really trying to grapple with what that means in terms of their end product and how they're going to meet their customer expectations. There are also regulatory pressures, right? This is a very pertinent time frame for this webinar because COP26 is going on right now. It started just a couple days ago, and we know that the food system is going to be discussed at length for many of the reasons that Bonnie mentioned. There are so many impacts associated with this sector. So there's these, international negotiations or pressures in terms of regulatory issues, but then there's also very specific ones. So companies are trying to navigate this international, regional, and very localized regulatory market. And one example is, California is now requiring recycled content in plastic beverage containers. So we expect more of this will continue to happen. Again, there are so many pressures on this that are experienced in this industry, and it's not just for brands, please don't mistake me, but they're the more consumer facing, obviously, so they get a lot of more of the pressure necessarily. And then they in turn are issuing requests of their suppliers because most of their impacts and risks are actually in the supply chain. And so what that looks like is all over the map, but it's really requiring certifications, audits. They may require you to fill out certain ESG frameworks or reporting mechanisms like CDP and EcoVadis. There may be certain sourcing standards that they're requiring of you. And so this is increasingly being a trend and will continue. In the middle there, the SBTI supplier targets, that's what we're seeing a lot of as well. So companies are starting to set science-based targets that rely on their suppliers setting science-based targets. And so there's a trickle-down effect. And one example of that is, pretty recently, within the last year or two, Mars, McCormick, and PepsiCo, they developed the Supplier Leadership on Climate Transition, or SLOCT. And basically, this is a way for them to help, meet their science-based targets because they themselves are requiring their suppliers to meet science-based targets. So they've developed a program to help enable that. And a lot of it's focused on education and setting up their suppliers for success. And I was actually just moderating a panel with Mars yesterday, and we were talking a lot about this. It was all based on Scope 3 emissions and how do you get your suppliers to help you along your journey. And so I think we're going to see a lot more of that, and then understanding where that pressure coming from is really helpful in thinking through priorities. So Bonnie, what emerging topics are you seeing right now in supply chains? And beyond that, like how are your standards and certifications evolving?
Yeah, thanks, Brittany. Well, like you said, there's a lot that's kind of coming, flowing up the supply chain, what you called kind of a trickle down effect, but maybe a trickle up effect in terms of heading up to source. So I think one of the biggest things is really a convergence of these sustainability priorities. And, this is something that I think is exemplified well by the Walmart Gigaton project. You'll see on the screen that, excuse me, the different icons: energy, waste, packaging, agriculture, forest, product use and design. These are all topic areas that are, really central to the food and agriculture sector, and are really topics that have already been taken up within kind of certification systems. And so, what is so interesting about this is that this convergence is occurring in a way where, agriculture systems are oriented, they're based in, they're rooted really in natural systems. So this kind of more integrated focus actually lends itself very, very well to the agriculture system, which by its nature is integrated. Agriculture, it's a resource-driven sector. So focusing on, priorities around resource reduction, but doing so in an integrated way, is really, where things are headed. Next slide, please. And so, as a reaction to kind of this convergence, I think, one of the things that we're seeing is that industry standards are really kind of evolving, to be more synergetic with ESG standards at the corporate level that you mentioned earlier, but also kind of these larger efforts. And so one of the examples that we see in this space, this is just one standard out of many, is Global Gap. I know many in the audience are, representing kind of the food safety and compliance, part of our food and agriculture system. And so Global Gap is a really meaningful standard for, that part of our audience. With the version 6 standard revision that is set to be released in April 2022, Global Gap is including kind of an annex on environmental sustainability, as well as really adopting an impact-driven approach with integration of data on really some key material topics that you've brought up: energy, water, nutrients, crop protection products. These are all core focus areas of, for example, the Walmart Gigaton project. So what's really great for those in our audience is to just know that there's, you know, some tools and some mechanisms that are already kind of being developed and are set to, you know, to be kind of audience ready in the coming year. I've had the pleasure to work with Global Gap on their environmental sustainability focus group for the last year and a half towards kind of the development of the standard, and having kind of that inside view. I think that this will be a very helpful tool for those operations that have maybe been looking at water, soil, crop protection applications in the view of food safety, and really being able to kind of extend out from that and really integrate some sustainability priority areas around the topics that they're already kind of looking at within their compliance system. One of the things that's really nice about the annex is it provides some level of kind of stepwise compliance, but it also provides kind of a suite of recommendations for those operations that are maybe being asked to go a little bit further than what the standard or the compliance system is asking them to do. They can move ahead and really adopt some of the topics that are, you know, set as a recommendation in terms of achieving compliance, but really will be useful for them to kind of move forward in a strategic manner. All right, so Brittany, with so much pressure on the food and agriculture sector, what are some of the best practices that you're kind of seeing being adopted in response?
Yeah, great. And I think this is a great lead on to what you were talking about, some, you know, convergence. So I think that's happening a lot, even at like the corporate and ESG reporting sectors too. There's a lot of energy around synthesizing and streamlining, which is really exceptional. And I think that kind of leads into some of the best practices. So ultimately, these are just some common, I guess, words of advice that, you know, we're often talking with our clients about. So, you know, the first thing is really focusing on governance. Like none of this will really be a huge surprise, but I cannot emphasize enough like how strong leadership is essential to your ESG process. Having backup and buy-in from your leadership is crucial in order to actually put money and budget and resources behind all the initiatives that you're focusing on. And with that, it seems so simple, but create a communication structure if you don't have one, making sure that people are talking not only within your business units, like within procurement or within R&D, but across. I feel like a lot of companies are still operating in silos, and it creates confusion in many ways and duplication and inefficiencies. So creating that structure is really important. Even things like meeting cadences, establishing responsibilities, and we're actually seeing a lot more incentives-driven mechanisms from leadership or even, you know, from the management level. Providing ample training and support is again obvious but very key, and I think with this one in particular, creating redundancies within your organization is essential. You know, if you only have one person who's responsible for preparing a report or for a certification, and then they get promoted or transition, or whether inside or outside of the company, you want to make sure that somebody's there to pick up and be able to make that transition smooth and increase those efficiencies. And really in terms of governance as well is, again, setting that strategic direction. I think very often in this world, there are too many priorities and people are trying to tackle them all at once. We're not, as much as we want to be, we're not superhumans, and in many cases, nor are our companies. You may only have one or two people who are even able to dedicate any time to ESG in your company. And so really making sure to set strategic priorities, but also bold and ambitious, but feasible solutions. So that's really key. And then of course, planning accordingly. Again, like this is really just reminders of what you may already be doing. And if all you take from this is like looking at your existing procedures and kind of revamping, that will be really critical and hopefully really helpful for you. But in terms of planning, you know, just recording all requirements. So I know so many companies and many of you on this call are getting requests from all over the place, and those requests are increasing. And so just putting them all on the table, what are the requirements we need to meet? what gaps are there, like where are these gaps duplicated, where are requirements duplicated, and just really making sure you can create a seamless and streamlined and efficient plan of action. And that comes with planning backwards from the due dates. So these due dates are all over the place. Some things you can rely on though year over year. You know, CDP reporting is going to be due at the end of July. Okay, so let's plan backwards and make sure we're not doing it last minute. And that also comes with having a strong project manager. And I think, you know, even in the panel that I was moderating yesterday, it was with Mars, RBI, and AstraZeneca. And one of the things that came up was that, you know, the project manager doesn't necessarily have to be a sustainability professional. You really need just somebody who can orchestrate and make sure everyone's assigned responsibilities and that deadlines are met. And so thinking through who is that person in your organization and how can you set them up for success and not provide barriers. And that will hopefully streamline a lot of the requests you're getting. I think the other thing really is to communicate frequently. And I don't just mean internally, I mean externally. Collaborating with your key customers and suppliers. We actually do a lot of customer and supplier interviews in our role, and you'd be amazed at how infrequently customers hear from their suppliers. Engage in that dialogue, ask them what they're looking for, what are they thinking about, what risks are they seeing, what trends are they experiencing, like what could be coming down from their perspective in 3 to 5 years, so you can start preparing for it now. Setting goals that are right-sized and ambitious. I keep kind of restating this, but I think people try, especially because a lot of companies are playing catch up. You know, sustainability is, in the last year or two, exploded. And I think that folks are trying to tackle too much all at the same time. So just be honest with where you are and transparent about where you're trying to go. No one's expecting you to go from 0 to 100 in 2 seconds, right? You have some time, but make sure that you're still trying to be ambitious within your means. And that means like tracking and reporting out on your KPIs regularly, communicating with your stakeholders, making sure that they are updated and feel involved and have confidence in your ability to improve over time. And then the last bucket is really getting involved. And I think, just to reiterate what I mentioned earlier, ambitious goals, no matter what they are never solved in silos. You know, we may think that we can capture or tackle a problem as an individual, but it takes a team, and it doesn't just take an internal team, it takes a community. And so thinking about joining industry associations, creating focus groups, you know, we're hearing a lot more about the willingness of companies to have pre-competitive collaborations. I feel like we've talked about this for the past 5 years, and I think finally it's starting to happen a little bit more. And so don't shy away from that. I think especially in the ESG field, you know, professionals across the industry and across companies are really interested in learning from each other in a way that's motivating for me and hopefully inspiring for you as well. Take advantage of that, get involved. And along those lines, like, don't try to reinvent the wheel. Many of you may have a very advanced, maybe very advanced in your journey on this call. In fact, I know many of you are, but even those who aren't, you know, we don't need to reinvent what others have done in the industry and where they're going. So take advantage of what existing programs and mechanisms there are. Maybe even find a champion in a company that's even outside of your existing sector and kind of get a sense of what they've done in the past and what, you know, systems and resources they've utilized. There's plenty of resources out there. It's kind of sifting through them and figuring out what's right for you. All right, so Bonnie, I think this is one of our last planned questions, but so with that, what are some tools that you would recommend, or perhaps some resources you could reference, or you recommend referencing?
Great, thanks, Brittany. Yeah, I think what I'm going to do in the next set of slides is really kind of go over 5 best practices, and a lot of them really tie into what you just brought up, you know, plan, communicate, governance, collaboration. The first is, you know, really use your existing frameworks as a springboard, you know, to start an ESG journey or to integrate ESG priorities into, adjacent topics that you're already managing. So I really focus on, creating a very strong internal management system. For those of you that already have a very strong internal management system where you're managing maybe various different certification or compliance programs, it's really looking at what you're doing, within that compliance system. And if it's not covering all of the topics that you're being asked to address by your customers, then, looking at how to just tweak and expand your existing system to integrate that. Some of the, the existing internal kind of mechanisms that I see as being, very useful is, really leveraging any sort of kind of committee that is already existing, whether it's an operations or steering committee. You mentioned kind of communication across silos. If you don't have those committees already set up, really consider, pulling one together that is really reflecting the different parts of your operations. Just as an example, within food safety management systems, typically operations that have been involved in a food safety compliance system for a number of years have already developed, really strong systems for specifically looking at food safety. Those systems include a lot of really useful tools that can be expanded and applied. So for example, risk assessments was mentioned, earlier, just looking at ESG risks along the supply chain. So within that supply chain, really taking, what is that approach to, to risk assessment, looking at different options for controls and mitigating those risks. That thinking is already there for those of you that are trained in food safety or another type of compliance mechanism. It's really kind of taking that systems thinking and kind of expanding it out and applying it to a new area. So there's some really good examples of how to do that. Systems that are already kind of asking for some level of soil or water testing, they might be asking for a specific thing, but that you need to start doing more soil testing to look at soil moisture for, really looking at reducing, the water that you're putting on crops. Or for water testing, you're extending out from just water quality to really thinking about, what is water availability looking like, and perhaps kind of switching a little bit kind of the viewpoint on water. Food safety systems always have a really strong training regime and are really well positioned for farmer engagement. So that kind of engagement through kind of training is really useful and valuable. I think in terms of really learning and moving forward in terms of sustainable agriculture, it's switching that by integrating new topics, but also changing a little bit the approach. You're not just providing materials for others to learn. You need to actually learn from farmers, and you need to learn a little bit more from kind of production on, what is really a meaningful timeline for integrating kind of different approaches to food production. And then, of course, food safety traceability system, those are very, very well established for controlling kind of risks for food safety reasons. And different systems like blockchain traceability, which, is really offering a great opportunity for really tracing back to source, not only for food safety, but for other kind of sustainability areas that are being asked to be addressed, such as deforestation issues. Next slide. Great. So you mentioned goal setting, and I think that this is a really important one for operations that are further up the supply chain. So really look at setting a sustainability goal that is going to help guide progress on those priority topics. Really the ones that we've already looked at in this webinar. So, corporate ESG teams tend to be better versed in setting goals along timelines and then, seeking to achieve those through their direct operations and supply chain. And some in our audience might have been kind of on the receiving end of, having to respond to their goals. I'd really encourage operations to look at setting their own goals, or if if you don't want to start there, looking at what preset industry or association level goals are already out there that you can either kind of align to, or really look at those preset goals and determine within your own operations whether you can exceed those, either by hitting that target at an earlier timeline or going above and beyond that. But I think it's really useful for operations, whether it's a grower or a processor that's buying from different farmers, to have their own goals and be able to really kind of activate their operations teams towards achieving those goals. And of course, we really want those to be synergetic with some of the larger goals that are out there. So the next one is really kind of, you obviously want to be leveraging tools, but I say leverage free tools because there's a number of them that are out there that can really help actors further up the supply chain. And I'm really just highlighting two on this slide. The first one is really supportive of prioritizing goals. And I think that these are really meaningful because in order for sustainability within supply chains to actually make positive impacts towards meeting kind of these larger ESG goals, and indeed, really kind of creating any sort of long-term resilience for farmers, we have to also be looking at, what are the short-term solutions for farmers, for food and agriculture operations that can really kind of cultivate these longer-term practices. And so in this way, I think it is really great to get started with kind of like prioritization and also really start measurement early. So the first one is from the SCI platform, that's the Sustainable Agriculture Initiative platform, and it really sits within their farm sustainability assessment standard. And it's the priority screening tool. This is a new tool that's been developed as part of the Farm Sustainability Assessment, which I'll refer to as the FSA. This has been developed for the new version 3.0 that has just launched this year. It's really a rapid screening tool that can be used by a procurement officer, a sustainability officer, a manager within a vertical operation, really anybody who is kind of at that nexus of, of sourcing with a number of different farmers, independent or maybe they're organized, under an umbrella of one company. It's very flexible in that way. But the tool is really utilized to rank the most important topics within that group of farmers. And it does so with the aim to kind of help guiding, what we would see as kind of an ESG strategy or a plan for kind of, really meaningful improvements across those farms that, you're planning out for the next 3, 5, 10 years. It's a tool that's part of the FSA, but you can use it without having to kind of move forward with going through the farm sustainability assessment process, which is also utilizing a farm level assessment that's comprised of over 100 questions across these kind of main priority topics that we've already kind of discussed. The second tool is really focused on measurement. This is the Cool Farm tool by the Cool Farm Alliance. I've really seen this tool gain a lot of traction in the last 5 or so years. What I really like about this tool is it's practical, it's free, and it also really addresses a gap that we've seen in kind of the voluntary sustainability standard space for a while, which is that operations tend to kind of look at addressing their GHG emissions in terms of tracking, monitoring as kind of like a last topic. I think the reason why is just because it's not as integral to production decisions as is, water, nutrient inputs, and some transitions to, more efficient energy use. So the Cool Farm tool kind of provides this ready-made free tool. You don't have to learn how GHG emissions work necessarily. It's easy to use, And what's great about it is it actually fills the requirements for a number of voluntary sustainability standards on the topic of climate and greenhouse gas emissions. So very useful in that sense. Next slide. Great. And then, so this one, really incorporating industry efforts, technology, and innovation, and making sure that you're doing so in a way that it's meaningful to your actual, business operations. So here we're looking at kind of risks and opportunities. In terms of risks, I really wanted to highlight some risks on kind of people and product. We talked a little bit about kind of modern slavery and issues around forced labor. We know in the food and agriculture industry that recruitment is really a nexus where forced labor kind of leaks, let's say, into a supply chain. And so this is where we really have to look at, addressing this issue. It's a really important area. It's not the only one, but it's a very important area to start looking at. Many operations are already, maybe utilizing a social compliance program that's looking at their direct and temporary workforce, but it's really focusing on kind of that site operations. The Responsible Recruitment Toolkit offers a free kind of assessment for looking at that risk. And I like this because it's a free tool to use. It also provides some options for paid use for this tool to kind of be utilized within a supply chain where, sub-suppliers can be monitored and managed. EFI, the other option, they also have developed a free responsible recruitment scorecard. It's an interactive tool that can easily be utilized to kind of identify and understand better your recruitment risks. And I think that both of these are really important because this is an area that I often see as a bit of a blind spot. So these are, again, free tools that are, available to you and kind of filling that space. Blockchain systems, we talked about a little bit earlier. These are just, I see really increasingly being adopted to really get at product associated risk. And, deforestation, there's a lot of other risks that they kind of address, but really focusing on kind of transparency as a source. So the next kind of part of the slide is looking at kind of some opportunities around production decisions. There's a lot of systems that are, coming onto the market that are helping food and agriculture companies to leverage kind of big data to make these really meaningful production decisions in real time. And that, for me, is what is so exciting, is that this communication channel with data is occurring not only down the supply chain to kind of report on impacts, but really leveraging big data to make really meaningful decisions on production. Simios is a product that I have seen in action with a few of our clients, and I really like it because it uses farm level kind of smart weather and data collection stations that are informing, real-time decisions on crop production, input applications, on water, on pest and disease pressure. And one of the things that I saw with a client recently that was really cool is that in order to kind of adopt this particular system, they really leveraged the kind of governance structure within their operations to make a cost benefit decision around the adoption of this platform. What they did is they basically decided that they would use the budget allocated for agrochemical applications, reduce an application and take that budget to purchase the software, thereby using the software to better inform their operations so that they did not need that application. So in that case, you're getting such a win-win where, you know, it didn't cost anything more. They're actually able to report a decrease in, you know, product inputs on their crops, and they're getting so much amazing data to just really inform, you know, real-time decision making. Agrarian is one that I wanted to include because I would call it the system that I see most widely utilized, and it really supports integrated pest management development. If integrated pest management is not already used at the farm level, it's a really useful tool as part of that system. These are just two tools. There's many others that are out there, but I think what's really useful within the food and agriculture system is having a platform that's not only kind of tracking data, but able to kind of allow for this multi-year analysis and reporting, but also, you know, giving that data back so that decisions can be made around, you know, some of the different kind of approaches to agriculture that we're seeing. And that kind of tees us up for the next slide. Great, and so this is the last one. You know, really focus on practices that will support your operational resiliency in a changing climate. There's a lot of attention on regenerative ag right now. You know, it was mentioned as a trend, and I think the reality is that, you know, it really does offer some great opportunities as a nature positive solution for the food and agriculture sector. Really looking at carbon sequestration as an opportunity. But in truth, we know that any change to production is iterative, and we know it takes time to scale that. And so the leaders that I really see in this space are, you know, incorporating practices from these different approaches that you see on this slide. You know, climate smart agriculture to really know, you know, what is changing in the climate and how is that going to change, you know, your operations. And really looking at kind of testing out, you know, some different practices that are pulled from these different approaches, and finding the right mix for, you know, for your crop, your product, what you're growing, what you're distributing, and how it's grown. I think the most important thing to really kind of focus on is for those that haven't, you know, really looked at kind of measuring what you're doing, is to really focus on measuring the inputs and the results along, you know, the practices on the screen: water, energy, climate, integrated pest management, waste, soil, biodiversity, and people. And with that, I think we're actually getting really close to time. So I want to kind of transition our kind of presentation and dialogue between Brittany and I to some questions. I think we'll be able to stay on the line a little bit longer to answer some of the questions, and those questions that are not answered, we will be able to respond to in an email format to those of you who have asked them. So we've got just a few minutes, and
yeah. Bonnie, I can start with a question to you, if that's helpful.
Great.
Great. So, so you mentioned the FSA priority screening tool. How is the farm sustainability assessment used in a supply chain sourcing from many different independent growers?
Great. Yeah, so I mentioned the priority screening tool. The farm sustainability assessment is a suite of questions that are applied at the farm level. It is applied within what's called a farm management group that is organized within, you know, within the supply chain. It's a great program that allows for, you know, really tackling ESG across a wide number of growers that are not organized in an otherwise manner. So yeah, if there's any kind of interest around, you know, this program or any others, you know, we're here to help you kind of navigate those differences and hopefully get you on track for, you know, the program and the tool that's right for you.
Great.
I'm just looking to see, I think we're at time, but maybe we'll do one more question, and then the rest we can hit on. I'm not sure if there are any others, but here's one. How can a small, medium-sized company get involved without getting overwhelmed? I'm getting a lot of pressure from large customers to take the plunge.
Yeah, that's a great question. I can start, Bonnie, and feel free to add on. I think it's a tough question to answer without knowing necessarily who you are, but I think it really comes down to being able to prioritize what your customers are asking you to do and speaking with them about what's reasonable in a given time frame. So I think that larger customers and brands are starting to understand a little bit more now, more than ever, that questionnaire fatigue is really a real thing. And so having that dialogue with your customers is a really great place to start, but also thinking through all these requests you're getting, what are the similarities? Are they all asking the same thing or different things? Or if they're asking different things but are getting at the same concepts, maybe seeing if something that maybe a more formal program like CDP or something could be sufficient for their needs. So really it's an exercise of figuring out where most of the pressures are coming from and identifying similarities across requests, and then really figuring out where you're able to spend your most time and attention. And I think some of those things like gap analyses and benchmarking can be helpful, but if you're getting specific requests, I think really just understanding where most of the risk is by not following through on them. The only other thing I'd add, and Bonnie, I'd love your thoughts too, is, I think ultimately you can't do everything all at once, but finding people within your company who want to be champions of this work, right? So even if you don't have a sustainability professional on staff, you might have someone who's really interested in it or willing to go above and beyond and kind of think through a little bit more deeply outside of even their job description, to learn and to understand and to make that part of their personal mission. And that's another way to kind of think about how to streamline and not get too overwhelmed, but making sure that person or persons are able to free up that time as well from a business perspective.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I agree with everything you said, and maybe just to add to that, look at what tools are out there. If you look what you're already doing, look at the programs you're already implementing, and and look at how the efforts within that system, can help support, maybe some further development within that space, towards, really being able to report on what you're being asked to by your customers. So, we see this a lot. So there's, for example, a lot of programs, in agriculture will focus on water, but they might not focus on kind of quantification or really kind of within the program itself setting targets for reduction. So in that sense, you kind of have to do a little bit more, but you're still utilizing that program to help with kind of the monitoring and staying on track. So I would just say, for some of you out there who are looking at, getting started, you probably have already gotten started. You just don't know that yet.
Yeah, and I think part of that overwhelming feeling is common. So don't feel, embarrassed by it. Like, that's very common in this industry right now and across industries. Something we're seeing a lot more too is, again, I guess going back to what I was saying before, utilize the resources like Bonnie said, but also like the people in your network, right? Mm-hmm. You may have people who've already figured this stuff out. And you may also, I guess we're getting a lot more requests lately of just, generic, like general sustainability assistance. So like that phone a friend concept. So if you have a consultant or like a professional that you know and trust, and it's their job to already figure this out, and you can rely on them to give you guidance or even validate what your priorities are. That's something we're seeing too, is really just wanting that extra support, maybe like an hour conversation to make sure what you're thinking about makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That's great. Well, Brittany, thank you so much. I have really enjoyed the hour with you, and I hope that it was valuable. I want to thank everybody in the audience who is still online. Thank you so much for your attendance, and we will be sending the recording of this webinar to you within the next day or two. So thank you so much, and everybody have a wonderful rest of your day.
Great, thank you.